Hi, this is Rick Hansen, and this is Amazing Greats, a podcast dedicated to talking with folks about their life journeys, their Jesus journeys. These are all actors, authors, musicians, athletes, people who we all know and love, and now we get to hear their stories on Amazing Greats. Today, we're talking with a gentleman by the name of Doug Burleigh. What a great story he has. You're going to love this one, a 50-year story of dealing with young people through young life and with politicians. Interesting. Check it out. Here we go. We are live and direct from Washington State to Washington, D.C., here with a mutual friend of mine. You've been recommended to me as a guest on our program here for a long time. George Tolles, Bob Janelle, Clem Daniels all say, you got to talk to this guy. He's got an amazing story, and his life is just animated. So here's our good friend, new good friend, Doug Burleigh. Doug, how are you? And how's it going today in the beautiful capital city?
Well, it's pouring down rain, so it reminds me of Seattle. Okay.
And we have sunshine out here. So what's
Good
up with
for
that?
you. Good for you.
Doug, you've served as a lifelong leader, no, not a lifelong, but a young life leader for 25 plus years, and including you were the national president of the organization for several of those years. You've been most recently with the Fellowship in Washington, D.C. You've led 65 Jesus conferences for young people in 15 nations in the former Soviet Union and every region of Russia. You've spent a lot of time there, including 150 plus visits to that part of the world. And I think we're going to start the conversation today with that because it's on the top of the news feed every single day. What's going on? And from your perspective, a guy who spent a lot of time there and know the people there, what's your overview of what's happening in Russia and the Ukraine right now?
Well, first of all, it's heartbreaking because these are two ethnic groups, the Russians and the Ukrainians, who have been intertwined for hundreds and hundreds of years. And I guess what I believe it's about is one man's ego, Vladimir Putin. By the way, the word Vladimir in Russian comes from the verb vladetь, which means to make or to take and mirror the world. So that's kind of the idea is he wants to redo the Soviet Union. And I think you remember his statement that one of the tragic things of the 20th century was the downfall of the Soviet Union. So I believe we have a president right now that's perceived on the international scene as somewhat weak, and so I think that's part of what is going on. Is I think he did it because he felt like he could. The tragic part about it is the number of people that are hurt. By the way, not just in Ukraine. And I just returned from 5 cities there speaking at prayer breakfast, but also Russia. A lot of people don't realize the Russians, they can't get anything in the West now. If you had a job that had anything to do with the West, you don't have it anymore. And they've suffered greatly. The sanctions have bit hard. And so it's not just the Ukrainians, it's the Russians. Everybody's suffering from this. We're just praying it'll end soon.
Yeah. And Jesus has a presence there, and you know that well, right?
I
Uh,
do.
we in the West kind of think of that as a godless area, but God is doing work in Ukraine and in Russia.
He is. I actually spoke at the Russian National Prayer Breakfast in November, and I had a chance to get up and talk about Jesus for 15, 20 minutes there. Were 500 at the breakfast, including many from the leadership of the Orthodox Church and from the parliament there, and even Putin's office. And you
Wow.
know, it's a nation that has embraced faith a lot through the Orthodox Church in recent years since communism fell. So I believe a lot of them don't want this war either.
Yeah. Was it a little intimidating to go to that part of the world in this when a war is actually uh, in progress?
Well, I operate by Psalms 91. If you remember part of that, it says that under his pinions, his wings, he will protect us. I've been going there for 59 years. I had a Russian visa. I was asked to speak at the breakfast, and I just told the Lord, unless you close the door, I'm going to go. And he opened it. So
That's amazing. That's
yeah,
amazing.
I can't live out of fear. You people this last breakfast in Ukraine, all four cities, the bombs fell the day that I spoke at prayer breakfast. But what is it? There's no fear in love. Perfect love casts out fear. I belong to Him. If it's my time to go, that I'll go that way. Not foolishly, but faithfully.
Yeah. Yeah.
So
Well, cool. And I hate to start with such a sombering note, but let's now just jump back into little Doug Burleigh as a child. Your parents were converted at a Billy Graham recruit, right? Is that how it all started?
1951 Memorial Stadium. We just moved into Hawthorne Hills in Seattle, opposite Laurelhurst, and built a home there. And the neighbors invited my parents. We didn't go to church, and they invited my parents to go to the Billy Graham Crusade. And they're in the top row of Memorial Stadium. And my dad gets up, and when they have the invite to come down, and he says, "Lorene, let's go." And we started to go to University Presbyterian Church, which was a wonderful church to grow up in. And I just remember all of a sudden we were going to church, and fourth, fifth, and sixth grade, they had a memory work program. I couldn't go out and play on Saturday until I memorized my verses. Altogether, it was probably 400 or 500 verses. It started with John 3:16, but by the third year, it was Romans 8:1-39.
Wow.
And that
Wow.
probably took me 3 or 4 hours. It'd take me the rest of my life now, but so I'm grateful for that. And
Yeah.
my parents also, I grew up, I would say it this way, a religious kid. I believed in God. I asked him into my life. I believe I was saved, but I really didn't know Jesus. And I had an experience in high school. Um, my parents had gone up to Malibu, the Young Life property, as adult guests, and they loved it. They came home raving about it. And I remember I was in junior high thinking that's the last place I'd want to go because, as about junior high age, you think your parents really don't know that much. They
Yeah.
get smarter later, but anyway. And so they sent me to Malibu, and against my will, I remember I was just turned 16. I had my driver's license, a girlfriend, life was good. And they sent me up there, and there were 20 kids from Roosevelt High School that went, all girls except me. And, it was the last place I wanted to go. And I love this. The Lord put me in a cabin with the wildest pagans in camp from Riverside, California. These guys, they had no idea what this camp was about, but all they wanted to do was party, girls, party. Okay. And so we'd have the cabin time at night after the message, and they'd be out on the golf course kissing girls, and one by one, the head counselor would bring them in by the scruff of the neck. So, our cabin times were wild affairs. I mean, they didn't want to talk about Jesus at all. And then I remember the night of the cross message, about day 5, I'm walking up the stairs to the cabin, and the ringleader, a guy named Mike, I walk by him as he's talking to our counselor, and he's got tears in his eyes. And I, our cabin time was a different story that night.
Wow.
Guys are really engaging the fact that Jesus Christ died for them. Never realized that. I think I'd heard it, but it didn't really it affect me as much personally. And Anyway, at the end of the time, the counselor said, well, anybody that wants to pray, we talk to God. And I remember Mike prayed, and it was the worst prayer I'd ever heard in my life. In other words, didn't pray anything like the kids at church did. And then they flipped the lights out. And I'm laying in bed thinking about his prayer. And the more I thought about it, it was the best prayer I'd ever heard. Number one, he was honest and vulnerable in front of all of his buddies. And I realized that Mike had something I didn't have. He had a relationship begun with Jesus. Next day, I went out and asked Jesus to come into my life. Best decision of my life, August 21st, 1961. Not that we're keeping track. I remember at the say so at the end of camp, you get up and they have a say so. You stand up, and I'm over in the corner of Big Squawka there in the camp, and I say, I'm Doug Burleigh from Roosevelt High School. This week, I asked Jesus to come into my life. I'm going to stand tall for him.
Wow.
So
Wow.
everything changed after that. I really think I understood then it was more than a religious point of view, a ticket to heaven. It was a love relationship with a person. And it's just grown on from that time.
Well, I love the line from the book. You said, "Goodbye, religion. Hello, Jesus."
Yeah.
Uh, and
Jesus never came to establish a religion called Christianity. If you can find that in your Bible, you'll be the first one I've ever met. What he did is he came for the whole world, for everybody. I just got home from Erbil, Iraq, this last week, and we're working with the Kurdish leadership, the prime minister of the Kurds. Um, this morning at the ambassador's breakfast in Washington, we had the Archbishop of the Catholic Church, who I'd met with last week, who came from Erbil, and he's in Washington. We're going to have a prayer breakfast later this year, and we'll have the Yazidis, the Muslims, the Christians, and people say, "Oh, it's an interfaith breakfast." No, no, it's a Jesus breakfast, and Jesus came for the whole world, everybody.
I love
And
that distinction. Wow.
yeah,
That
yeah.
is powerful.
And a Muslim, it's interesting, a Muslim doesn't need to convert to Christianity. All he needs to do is repent and follow Jesus. In other words, and by the way, it's not a bad word, but if you Google Christianity, it says the religion Jesus founded. No, he didn't. He came for the whole world, for
Hmm.
everybody.
Hmm.
So,
So on let's progress into that is an incredible story and something I have not heard. And I've been stalking you, Doug. I've heard a lot of good stuff, but that's a great story. As a student, a high school student, a college student, you excelled. You were a great student, academically very solid. And one place along the way where I did stalk you, I saw where you had said that you never heard your dad say he was proud of you, and you think that was maybe a part. Do you think that was a part of the incentive of being so dutiful in your academics?
yeah, I do. And by the way, I love my dad. He was a World War II pilot. I was actually born in Norman, Oklahoma, in the Naval Air Base 12 days before Roosevelt died in 1945. But he had a broken relationship with his father. He was the only one of seven kids that went to college. And when he left the farm in Bend, Oregon, his dad stood on the porch and said, "You're a no good so and so. You'll never amount to anything." And that
Mm.
tape replayed in his life. So I don't fault my dad. I think he had a broken relationship with his father, and the Lord really healed me from that through an experience in the 80s called an intensive that really was an amazing experience of going off to a cabin for 3 weeks, meeting with a counselor um, that founded Fuller's School of Psychology. And what it did for me is it helped me love my dad from my heart. But I think I was probably a bit of a workaholic and a people pleaser. It's interesting. I had a couple sisters, both of whom were looking for love and looked for it in the wrong places by college age. Both of them had slept around, and I get it. I kind of went the other direction.
Hmm.
But, we're not attacking fathers. What we're doing is realizing, we want to turn it around. And I've got three sons and a daughter that I tell them every day how proud I am of them, how much I love them, and so on.
So at this point in time, you're kind of doing well in school. You're academically solid, but then some options came your way. You could have been a lawyer. You could have gone to work for the CIA, but you didn't do either of those. What did you do, Doug?
Well, it was the fall or the summer of '67, and I had graduated from college the year before from Willamette University in political science and Russian studies. By the way, had got a fellowship, a National Defense Fellowship to go to the Soviet Union my sophomore year, and several times went to the Soviet Union in college. So then I went to grad school at the University of Washington in political science, and I was just finishing a master's degree, and they asked me to go on and get a doctorate. I also was admitted to law school at the University of Washington in the class of the fall of '67. And I had been flown out to Washington, D.C. in spring break and spent a week in Langley. And the CIA had offered me a career position where you get a PhD as well. And all those options were there. And oh, by the way, Young Life had asked me to work for them at the challenging salary of $300 a month, which, by the way, was more then than it is now. But still, yeah, not the most prestigious thing. And I never even prayed about it. I was driving a Seattle Transit bus early in the morning and in the rush hours, morning and afternoon, and in between writing the master's thesis. And I couldn't get a passage out of my mind. It was Luke 9:23-25. If anyone wants to follow me, he must deny himself, take up his cross, and keep close behind me. He that seeks to save his own life will lose it. The one who loses his life for my sake will save it. What shall it profit a man if he gains the whole world and loses or forfeits his own very self? And again, I wanted to be somebody, and it was like the Lord was whispering to me, Doug, are you willing to be nothing for me? And I honestly couldn't get it out of my mind. I'm driving the bus, and at the end of we got a little break. I'm sitting there at the end of the line, and I'm thinking about that passage. I remember walking into the law school and resigning my position, and the woman says, well, we've got 300 people on the wait list. If you changed your mind tomorrow, it'd be too late. God told me to work with kids. Oh, my professor, I was his A student, John Reshitar, a wonderful man, PhD from Harvard at 24. And he looks at me and he goes, social work? Because the youth corps had just started. And he said, don't do it for over 2 years. Well, I did it for 25. But so October 1, 1967, I went on the Young Life staff. And it's one of the best decisions I ever made, even at $300 a month.
Well, can you pinpoint one or maybe a couple of the spiritual highlights of that time, introducing young people to Jesus through Young Life?
Well, let me mention this, and I mention it in my book, is 50 years later, 2017. I'm in Washington, D.C., working with the fellowship, and we closed the Cedars where I work. It's a 7-acre property 10 minutes from the Capitol. We have all kinds of this morning. We had a whole bunch of ambassadors there for breakfast, and I have a couple of breakfasts a week that with leaders of government and people and ambassadors and so on. We close it in August because of the Senate House recess. So I always go to the Northwest in August. Plus, it's hazy, hot, and humid out here in August. And so I went out there and I decided that I wanted to look up 150 kids that I had 50 years ago. And it was one of the most gratifying experiences of my life, person after person after person. You'd meet with them and they'd go, oh gosh, and they'd say stuff like this: you changed my life. I didn't change anybody's life. Jesus did. I'll give you one example. Dave Crystal, he was in my Young Life Club in Tacoma, Washington, and we had a little thing we called the Green Berets, and we'd meet at 6 a.m. at the Maverick Steakhouse, and they'd memorize verses each week and so on. And he's a U.S. District Court judge now in Tacoma, and he's pro-life. He loves the Lord. He married a believer. All his kids are walking with the Lord. He's surrounded by uber liberals all around him. And he just looked at me. He says, he said, I love Jesus. And he said, I just want to say thank you for introducing me to him. But person after person after person. And what I realized is it was one of the most gratifying things of my life to see that, all these lives that were changed not by me, but I got to be involved with Jesus. So I had a chance to do that, and I'm still involved with hundreds of kids I had in club. We call it the wet cement years, where boys become men, where girls become women, and where decisions are made that affect the rest of their lives. And I can think of hundreds and hundreds of kids that's true, and I got to be part of it.
Yeah.
So what a
What do you
joy.
think, because of your background with young people over in those days, and now you look at young people today, what's your overall opinion? Where's this generation at right now? Some people would say it's a lost generation. Other would say that's not really true. How do
Yeah.
you view it?
I think the central word is identity, is the whole trans and gay, everything else. It's all about identity. And, you know, we find our identity in Jesus Christ, Rick, and we realize that's where we get it. And that's the only place you're going to get it. Okay. Is you're not going to get it in achievements. You're not going to get it. I mean, you think you do, but it's hollow. And so I think that is the central issue, um, is identity. And I all the rest of it are symptoms. The trans thing. I don't know if you know this, but I recently heard that 40% of transsexuals that have the operation end up committing suicide. In
Mm,
other words, they discover that wasn't the answer to
mm.
go from a boy to a girl. You still got that hole in your heart. So I would just say it that way: is it's more extreme than it was, the way they're acting out, but the need is the same. I love that. I was reading Colossians the other day, and 2:3 says, in him are hidden all the treasures of wisdom and knowledge. A few verses later in 2:10, it says, moreover, your completeness is only realized in Jesus Christ. Everybody's looking to be complete, and it's
Hmm.
only realized in Christ. There's a wonderful word in Scripture, teleos. It means perfect or fully mature. It's used twice in Scripture. Once in Matthew 5:48 in the Sermon on the Mount, where Jesus says, "Be perfect, even as your Father in heaven is perfect." But the one I love is the one in Colossians 1, where it says, "The mystery hidden for ages and generations, but now revealed to the saints. To them God has chosen to make known among the Gentiles the glorious riches of this mystery, which is Christ in you, the hope of glory." And then verse 28 of Colossians 1, we proclaim him, admonishing and teaching everyone in all wisdom, that we might present everyone perfect, teleos, in Christ. And then Paul says, this is what I work at with all the energy God has given me. Well, you know what I think it means, Rick? I think it means the person that God had in mind when he created Rick Hansen or Doug Burleigh. And how are you going to discover that shimmering diamond? Because he never made another one exactly the same way. Love God with all your heart, all your soul, all your mind, and your neighbor as yourself. And on that journey, you're going to discover what God had in mind when he created you. And I think that's the beautiful thing that we offer to kids, is the Savior who will show them who they are. And it's
Hmm.
just a thrill. And that's the answer to the problem. And a lot of kids are looking in all the wrong
So
places.
let's jump into what your next phase. Your history is kind of in a couple of chapters, the
Yeah.
young life chapter, and then the fellowship chapter. And a
Yes.
lot of people are confused about what the fellowship is, and so I thought you would be the guy that could explain to me and to our audience what is the fellowship.
Well, it's a worldwide family of friends whose leader is Jesus. There's no titles. We don't have a president or a vice president and so on. And I think it pretty well copies what Jesus did with his disciples. He didn't come to create an organization. He came to create a family of friends, didn't he?
Yeah.
And there's brothers and sisters and so on. And that's really what the fellowship is it was started by a fellow who from Seattle, actually, a Norwegian named Abram Vrede, who came to Seattle in the 20s and started a group of city leaders in the 30s after the Great Depression. Then he went on to Washington, D.C., and started the little groups in the Senate and the House that still meet on Wednesday and Thursday morning. And by the way, they are the ones that really lead the prayer breakfast. We don't lead it. We're the ones that book the hotel and invite the guests and so on. But the leaders of government, the Senate and the House, really lead it. And so I would say it that way. It's not an organization. It's a family of friends that are all over the world. So
And to make it clear, it's not politically motivated.
no,
There's
no,
it's
Democrats and Republicans, liberals and conservatives, but it's all about Jesus, and He's the one that we all believe unites us together. So this morning, as I sat at the ambassadors' breakfast, a former Democratic congressman was sitting at the head. We had about 20 folks that were there, and we're brothers. We may not agree on all the political things, but we do agree that Jesus is Lord, and we're trying to follow Him.
That's refreshing because I think maybe it's got the stigma of being one way or the other, typically on the conservative side. And some people have, it's been described as being a very powerful secret organization.
Yeah.
It's
Well,
like,
Netflix did a 5-part hit job called The Family, and any relationship to the truth is purely coincidental. But you know what? And I'm featured prominently in the third one on the Russian collusion thing. I was investigated for that because we invited a gal named Maria Butina and her boss, who was the head of the upper house of the Russian parliament, Alexander Torshin, and she was imprisoned as a Russian spy and was released 18 months later. I didn't arrange any secret meetings for her and her boss, as I was accused of. But you know what? It went away. But I had to Google my name for a couple of years because of the number of articles and people on television. I found out all kinds of things that I did that I didn't do. But you know what was good about that is you read in the Sermon on the Mount, "Blessed are you when men shall revile you and persecute you and say all manner of evil against you falsely for my sake. Rejoice and be exceedingly glad." Well, so what are the verbs there? Blessed, rejoice, and be glad. So I did my best. Okay.
yeah,
I had to lawyer up and I got investigated by the Senate Intelligence Committee, but there was nothing there. And I knew that. And you walked through it, and it was, an experience you'd just as soon not repeat, but it happens. So,
So the National Prayer Breakfast, let's just jump in there a little bit because your father-in-law was the head of that. I mean, he was the guy who kind of spearheaded the National Prayer Breakfast. And then you, as when he passed, you kind of picked up the mantle there and are pretty much in charge to this day with the National Prayer Breakfast.
we wouldn't say it that way. No.
Okay.
Doug never had a title. I think he was sort of a patriarch, and we recognize that. But you'd never see him up front at any time ever. Okay, it
Hmm.
was always behind the scenes. So that's how we do the prayer breakfast. Is we don't have a president or a leader of the breakfast. All of us just have different roles. One of my roles is I invite a whole lot of friends from the former Soviet Union and some other nations that I'm involved with. I was the keynote speaker at the Brazilian breakfast earlier this year. I work with a bunch of leaders down there. I work with the Kurds in Iraq. But each of us have a role, and when if you think organizationally or institutionally, you won't understand what we're doing. And
Hmm.
I don't mean that organizations are bad. Here's the irony. I spent 25 years with Young Life and now 29 with the fellowship. I liked both of them. Okay. They were very similar. The difference that is I don't have a title. My business card has my name, address, telephone, and so on. And people look at it. And in Washington, where titles are big, they look at it again more closely. But what was Jesus' title? He didn't have one, did he?
No,
He
no.
he he was a friend. He was surrounded by people that loved him and so on. And it was all about relationship. We're just trying to quietly model that. So no, I don't head up the prayer breakfast. I'm involved with it with a number
Okay.
of others. Okay.
Yeah, thanks for that distinction. That's good. I appreciate that. So you're uh, at this point, you've also had some health challenges in your later years. I don't know how long ago it was, but you were diagnosed with prostate cancer. What kind of challenges emotionally, spiritually did you go through during that period of time?
Well, it's one of the best experiences of my life. And I would say it this way: God never wastes anything. So it came along here about 3 years ago, and I, I ended up doing proton radiation therapy 10 minutes from the Cedars. I would go up there. Yeah, I didn't miss the breakfast or the lunch. I'd be there. I didn't ask for this, but they gave me a 10:30 appointment every day. And, you'd go in there, you'd put your gown on. And I always did this. Somebody else was sitting over there, and there were two kinds of people in that hospital, Sibley Hospital, um, at Johns Hopkins, and two kinds of people: doctors and nurses, and people that had cancer.
Mm.
And so I'd sit there with somebody, and I'd go, "Hi, I'm Doug. What's your name?" "I'm Joe. Tell me your story." And I did that umpteen times with people. At the end of the proton radiation therapy, by the way, the next day I left for 28 days or 7 countries the very next day after I,
Wow.
but I slid off the gurney, and the two nurses said, "Mr. Burleigh," and I told them 10 times to call me Doug, but when I was 77 then, I'm 79 now. Uh, they call you Mr. Burleigh. You're the perfect patient. You're always on time. You're always happy, and you know all of our names. By the way, that's Young Life. You learn that.
Yeah. Yeah,
And
yeah.
then you walk out in the hall, and there's a bunch of doctors and nurses there, and they have you go up, and you chokes me up. You ring the bell, and everybody cheers because you finished the treatment and so on. And so I left the hospital that day, and I thought, gosh, what an amazing experience. Would I want to repeat it? Not necessarily. And I'm not trying to say that people don't have heartbreaking experiences with cancer. Of course they do. But, I think the way I viewed it, Rick, was God never wastes anything. And whatever comes along, if we take it in the right spirit, God uses it. And I connected with so many different people in the course of that experience that became friends, that became, soulmates that you were walking through it together with. So I would just say I learned a ton about Jesus, about myself. And I don't think I had any fear at all. What's the worst thing that could happen to you? You go
You
be
go
with
to
Jesus.
heaven.
Yeah. I don't think that's bad news. That was a little earlier than I'd hoped for, but I love that passage in Psalms 90:12. Lord, teach us to number our days aright and give us a heart of wisdom. We don't know our expiration date. I'm so glad I don't know. And I'm going to be running full speed right up to the tape, you
Yeah,
know?
yeah.
So
You certainly are living up to that right now. My gosh, you are one active guy. And with all of the experiences that you've had and all of the things that you've done, especially with regard to your relationship with those countries in Eastern European area, you had never written a book until now,
Yeah.
and your book, Jesus Changes Everything. Fantastic book. It's kind of a synthesis of who you are and what you believe. And I was just mesmerized by it. Tell me what brought you to finally put that book together. And is there
About,
another book in your
yeah,
future?
yeah. About 20 years ago, a friend, and I was in Gig Harbor, Washington, then working with the fellowship and raising our kids. And a gal friend there is an editor, and she said, "You know, Doug, you should write this stuff down. You've been teaching these principles for years, and you ought to write them down." And I just looked at her and I said, "You know, I don't think that. I don't think I'm an author." And then the pandemic came along about 3 4 years ago, and my father-in-law had died a few years before, and we lived together. He and I and Debbie and mother, and we had a 7 bedroom, 7 bath house that we really didn't need that big a house. So the lady said to me, "Well, we're going to pack the boxes, and you're not qualified to pack the boxes, but you can take them down the stairs." Which, by the way, I was thrilled. I wasn't qualified to pack the boxes, and
Yeah.
so I was going to the Cedars 3 days a week during the pandemic, and I came home on a Thursday night, and Friday I wrote The Purpose, the first chapter. Saturday I wrote The Work of God. Sunday I wrote What is the Gospel. Monday I wrote another chapter, and then I went back to the Cedars and for 3 days, and then came back and wrote 4 chapters in 4 days. And I'd take 10, 12 hours, and I'd be in Doug's study. He died a few years before, and Rick, an amazing thing happened. This happened over and over again. I'd be in there, and I'd think of a story I hadn't thought of in 20 years that perfectly fit. Because when you're talking about these principles, the best way to illustrate them is stories. And I'd find myself weeping and saying to the Lord, "It's so much fun to write a book with you, not about you, with you." And I felt his presence. So I wrote the whole thing in less than 4 weeks. Uh,
Wow. Wow.
yeah. Now, I do have another book, by the way, and this is an interesting one. And I actually like this one better. Okay. And you ever heard of Storyworth? You ever heard of this?
No.
It's all one word, okay? And about 3 years ago, I got a Christmas present from two of my four kids, John, who's an attorney in Gig Harbor, and Katie, who's a housewife in Wilmington, North Carolina. And they gave me a thing called Storyworth, all one word. And what you do is you get an email every Monday morning beginning January 1, and it's got a question. Okay. What was your relationship like with your mother? And you've got a
Oh
week
my.
to type that. And so I'd write 5 or 6 pages on that. And then the next week, you'd get another one. What's the riskiest thing you've ever done in your life? And I wrote about taking 27 kids to the Soviet Union in 1973, driving through on 3 microbuses,
Yeah. Wow.
10, 20, 30, 40, and this last August, 50-year reunions, and it changed all their lives. But, here's a 28-year-old bachelor driving them through the Soviet Union in minibuses. But anyway, so you got
Storyworth
50.
was then kind of the
Yeah,
format
yeah.
for you to move.
Yes, you type it, and then at the end of the year, they would make a book. And it took an extra year because John needed to get pictures, and we had boxes we'd been packing from moving, and so Debbie had to give him some pictures. But last summer, I got the book, and it's 295 pages. But Rick, it's your memoirs.
Wow.
And here's the funny thing: we were on a family vacation, all 26 of us, at a lake in Minnesota, and John brought it with him, and he gives it to me. And I'm embarrassed to tell you, I stayed up till 2 o'clock in the morning the next 2 nights reading my own book,
Reading
which
about yourself. Oh,
which I hadn't written. I'd written 3 years before. And I love this book. And it really is your memoirs. And the only reason I mention it to you is every one of us can do this. And I'll find myself sitting down reading a chapter thinking, yes, that's what I believe about whether it's politics, about integrity, but it's called Storyworth.
I
And
just jotted that down. That's great.
I
I'll put
gave
it
it
in
to
our show notes here too. So yeah.
I gave it to all my kids and grandkids. And James was just out here. He's 15 years old, and we've got 16 grandkids. All four of our kids have four, 8 boys, 8 girls. But James was out here on some kind of a school thing. He lives in Gig Harbor, Washington. And the last time I was out there in Gig Harbor, I go up to tuck him in at night, and he's reading my book. And he goes, Puppy, I just finished the book. And I said, well, which chapters did you like the best? And he names 2 right away. But so here you are, your kids and your grandkids. They read about your life and about what you believe about so many things, and they were great questions. John would pick the questions. He's the committee chairman for Young Life in Gig Harbor. He's an attorney. He knows everybody. He's very relational, and so I would tell you that's actually my favorite book. Okay,
Is that's available to the public or not really? Is it
well,
just
I give it to individuals that ask for it. Okay, it costs a little more because it's a limited edition. It's $40 a book, but I've probably given away 40 of them to friends. Who've just asked, can I read it? And then after they read it, they go, can I keep it? And I go, oh, okay. So interestingly enough, and I only mention it to you because I think it's one of the best things I've ever done. And I didn't choose it. My kids did it. By the way, they would get the emails each week. Okay. And I'd get a message back oftentimes, Dad, I never knew that.
wow?
Wow. And
So they get to keep up with your writing, huh? They keep,
yeah, the 2 of them did. Yeah. And they
yeah.
would get it. But again, it's 295 pages, 52 chapters, one for each week of the year, and great questions. They're just wonderful questions. So
Wow.
I would read a few of the chapter titles to you, but I just gave the only book I had with me away yesterday to somebody to read for a while because they really wanted to read it. So anyway.
Wow, I'm going to check into that. That sounds fantastic. And what a great
Story.
opportunity for somebody to write a memoir without having to, create it from scratch. They have something to work with as they
Yes.
move along.
Yeah. Here's a key takeaway. I've done this over and over and over again. I will sit with evangelical Christians and I'll say, according to Jesus, what's the purpose of a follower of Jesus Christ? And Rick, the most common answer is to win people to Christ or make disciples. So I'll say to them, well, okay, are you married? Yes. What's your wife's name? Susie. When you proposed to Susie, did you say, Susie, I love you. Will you have my children? Well, of course not. You said, I'll bet you said, I love you. Will you spend your life with me? And by the way, children came along. They weren't the goal. They were a byproduct of a love relationship. And according to Jesus, the answer is to love God with your heart, soul, mind, and strength, and your neighbor as yourself. And then he says, all the law and the prophets hang on these 2 commands. That's where we get the purpose. It's everything summed up in those 2. Okay. The same thing with chapter 2. What is the work of God? Okay. And most people will say to make disciples and so on, not according to Jesus. The work of God is to believe. And every issue in my life comes down to it. Every time I worry, get angry or fearful, it's a symptom of unbelief. The 3rd chapter, what is the gospel? Most people will give you 6 points or 8 points and then argue about the information. And we believe the gospel is a person. And Rick, it changed my life when I realized that. I get up and I talk about Jesus everywhere I go all the time. His deal, our buddy George, I've probably done 50 times with him. About 5 years ago, a businessman came up to me at his deal, and he said, every time you come here, all you talk about is Jesus. And he thought it was an oddity. And I'm thinking to myself, you know,
Right on.
yeah. So I wrote it because I think most people couldn't tell you, for instance, the attributes of a disciple, the things Jesus said. If you want to be my disciple, be a man of love, be a man led and empowered by the Holy Spirit, be a person who bears fruit, be a person of prayer. Most people couldn't name two or three of those things, and there are 10 of them, and it's Jesus' list. It's not my list. It's the things he told his disciples.
I could sit here and talk with you for probably another hour, but we are basically out of time. We've talked as long as our podcast is supposed to be, and then some. And it has been amazing. It's been just awesome to get to know you. Talking about, one of the themes through your whole book, as you have just described moments ago, is all about relationships with Jesus, relationships with people. And it feels like I have a relationship with Doug Burleigh right now, and that is a gift. And I appreciate your time and appreciate your story. And God bless you. Thank you.
Well, thank you, brother. It's a delight to visit with you. Obviously, we're kindred spirits. We love him. And that's called fellowship. And you know what fellowship is? A lot of fellows in the same ship. Okay.
Amazing Greats. Hey, it's Rick Hansen here. That was an incredible few minutes spending with Doug Burleigh. What an interesting guy. I didn't know much about him until I started digging deep into his story, and then found out what an amazing man he is, and what he's done is incredible, and his love for Jesus is unparalleled. Thank you for watching and listening to Amazing Greats. If you like it, click like or share it with a friend. Thank you, and God bless.